Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. This will be episode 16 in my series Bioweapon Blues. And I will be reading in this criminal complaint that was entered into a court of law in Switzerland in 2022. The date is July 14th. I think it's important. It gives you kind of a global or wide angle view of what's happening in other countries. And I think this is an important case. It also has an immense amount of evidentiary additions to the case. So if you're looking on the screen, you'll see this criminal complaint. It's 300 pages. So, actually, this is the summary that I have on. Let's see, that's not it. No, that is the criminal complaint. That's 300 pages of kind of detailing the law in Switzerland. But in addition to that criminal complaint, there's the 300-page evidence report as well. So you got a 300-pager plus this 10-page summary that I quoted in my last Bioweapon Blues 15. So I'm going to read it in its entirety. I think it's important to put it out there. And it was interesting. I had somehow people in Switzerland got it, and they've been listening to my show because of my covering this court case. And I'll put a link, and I did put a link into 15 to the website that has all of this information. So if you know somebody involved in any legal cases or upcoming legal cases, very worthwhile to get some of this information. It's also consistent with information that's coming out of independent sources in the U.S., right? So this is something that took place in Switzerland and Swiss academics, doctors, etc. But this is a fairly short, it'll be a short read, but I think it's just worthwhile just to listen and see what kind of information that they have. They've compiled there. Let's go back to that. So this is the Swiss Medic Criminal Claim Executive Summary. It's 10 pages. And I'll put it, like I said, I'll put a link to this in there. I have 17. I've got Bioweapon Blues episodes probably to past 20 at this point, but it's just a matter of time to put them into the record so people can listen to them. But this is from Cruz Law, and legal staff is Zollinger, Lechty, and title again is Swiss Medic Criminal Claim Executive Summary. 1, 37 complainants and 6 private claimants directly harmed by MNRA quote vaccination. So they use the term vaccinations in quotes in this whole thing. So I am probably just going to interpose or add the term shots. I'm not going to say it all because they actually have a question whether they're vaccines at all. I'll start again. 1, 37 complainants and 6 private claimants directly harmed by MNRA shots, all of whom are specified in the recitals, are filing the present criminal claim to protect their own health and out of legitimate concern for the health of their fellow human beings, too. What we are dealing with here is the greatest threat to human health caused by medicinal products and the greatest injury to human health that Switzerland has ever seen. The authorization and administration of the largely ineffective MNRA shots represent a far greater danger than the SARS-CoV-2 pathogen against which these shots are supposed to provide protection. 3, Swiss Medic is primarily responsible for this threat. By law, it has the central function of protecting the health of the Swiss population. To this end, it must ensure, on the one hand, that only high-quality, safe, and effective therapeutic products are placed on the market. On the other hand, it must protect consumers from therapeutic products against fraud. And they also reference articles of law, or I think it's their constitution. And so I would recommend people just go to the original documents. I'm not going to list those out, but they're basing this criminal complaint upon legal statutes. The notifying parties acting on behalf of Swiss Medic failed to comply with these guarantee obligations on several occasions and to a significant extent, which is why they have been under strong suspicion since December 2020 and up to the present day. Point 1, of having repeatedly violated the due diligence obligations under therapeutic product law, and in the course of marketing authorization and batch testing, which, according to federal court rulings, is deemed to be manufacturing in that they granted temporary authorization for the MNRA shots within the meaning of Article 9 TPA, despite the lack of sufficient evidence of efficacy and safety and despite massive risk signals. They massively undercut the already low safety precautions that are decisive for the procedure according to Article 9A TPA, and have thus created risk for public health that had never been posed by a medicinal product before. They not only permanently withheld elementary information on the minimal to complete lack of protective effect of the MNRA shots and the actual risk of side effects from the population and the medical community, but also systematically conveyed this information in a misleading manner, and of not having fulfilled the duty of post-marketing surveillance, so-called pharmacovigilance, in a risk-adequate manner, but rather having permanently violated the obligation to notify under therapeutic product law in a serious manner, of having seriously violated the prohibition on the advertising of therapeutic products, and of having satisfied the corresponding elements of an offense under the criminal code when a death, bodily injury has occurred. 4. The breaches of due diligence obligations complained of here essentially consist in the fact that the notifying parties acting on behalf of Swissmedic, and in principle also the notified physicians, were already aware of countless risk factors from December 2020 onwards, each of which, when assessed in isolation, would have prevented the granting of the temporary authorization and the administration of corresponding MNRA injections until the corresponding risk factors had been clarified in detail and eliminated under normal circumstances. The following should be highlighted here. And then they reference the 300-page document. At the end of 2020, the mRNA technology, which thus far has been used unsuccessfully as gene therapy in cancer patients only, was to be applied for the first time to a healthy general population as a precautionary measure, i.e. for prophylaxis. Compared to all other medicinal products approved ordinarily or temporarily, the authorization of this mRNA technology for healthy people represents an absolute abnormality. Animal studies, a mandatory requirement for ordinary authorization and a key safety element, had not been performed at all and had not been performed adequately. The human studies on which the temporary authorizations were based at the end of 2020 had run for just 2 months instead of the usual 12 to 24 months, thus lacking any long-term data on safety and efficacy. Shortly after the start of the study, the manufacturers, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, largely deprived these authorization studies of their informative value by disbanding the control groups. Accordingly, there's no way that the manufacturers will ever, and certainly not by the end of 2022, which they are legally obliged to do, be able to provide complete clinical documentation for the purpose of converting the temporary authorization into ordinary authorization. It's so incredible. It is already clear from the authorization documents that toxic, potentially mutagenic, and carcinogenic impurities are present in the mRNA shots with nitrosamine, benzene, and bacterial DNA. The mRNA shots also contain new ingredients that have not been tested or approved for use in humans, toxic lipid nanoparticles. These are potentially carcinogenic and can potentially impair fertility and harm the child in the womb. Possible risk in pregnancies was known to Swissmedic but was simply ignored. These clinical trials had already revealed clear risk signals such as evidence of increased morbidity in the vaccine group. By the end of 2020, there were already indications of possible long-term consequences of the mRNA shots, such as neurodegenerative diseases or autoimmune diseases. 5. Despite these and numerous other risk-increasing circumstances, the initial authorization of the mRNA shots was fast-tracked by Swissmedic. In just 63 calendar days, the applications for authorization were reviewed. An ordinary procedure would take 330 days. A procedure for temporary authorization usually takes 140 days. And important mandatory milestones were simply omitted. As a result of this, temporary authorization in the sense of Article 9A TPA means nothing more than the fact that the entire Swiss population unknowingly participated and continues to participate in the largest clinical experiment ever conducted in Switzerland, and indeed the world. 6. Without adequately addressing this risk created by the temporary authorization, Swissmedic unwaveringly proceeded to extend the authorizations to adolescents aged 12 years and older in June 2021. And this despite the fact that, in addition to all previous risk-increasing and therefore legally relevant facts, it was known by mid-June 2021, among other things, and then they reference the criminal claim, that there had been insufficient evidence of efficacy of the MNRA shots for adolescents in the authorization studies, that the dose approved for adolescents was half Comirnaty, or 5 times Spikevax, the recommended dose, thus posing a completely unnecessary risk to adolescents, that by February 2021, i.e. within just a few months, a total of 42,086 adverse events and 1,200 deaths had been reported in connection with Comirnaty alone, which should have led to the immediate termination of the study. That, according to global adverse event reports, the alarm value of 50 deaths had been exceeded by more than 150-fold by June 2021. 7. Even these alarm signals did not prompt Swissmedic to seriously question the path taken. Instead, at the end of 2021, Swissmedic took the step of extending the authorizations to a third dose, or booster, and to children from the age of 5 years, despite the fact that, by this time, it was also known, among other things, that data had been falsified in the Comirnaty authorization study, that the toxic spike protein produced in the body of the vaccinated individual is present in the body for longer than originally indicated by Swissmedic and manufacturers, and thus leads to a variety of severe adverse events, even death. That Pfizer-BioNTech had submitted an alarming interim report, PSUR, at the end of August 2021 that indicated 46 cases had been fatal in the clinical trials, and 5,115 cases, 1.6%, had been fatal in the so-called post-marketing phase. Wow. That 71 deaths were recorded in children in Switzerland, the EU, and the USA for Comirnaty and Spikevax alone, which means that the absolute alarm value of 50 deaths, which would have led to an immediate stop of any authorization of medicinal products, was clearly exceeded in this target group alone, which is in no way endangered by SARS-CoV-2. That more than 2,000 premature and stillbirths had already been reported after MNRA injections in the USA and EU alone. That teenagers are 6 times more likely to have heart problems, myocarditis, caused by COVID shots than they are to have severe COVID disease. That the MNRA shots, Comirnaty and Spikevax, had received 68 times the number of severe adverse event reports and 20 times the number of death reports per million doses administered as of the end of 2021 compared with influenza vaccines. 8. Instead of finally pausing and conducting an in-depth analysis of the decisions taken, Swissmedic maintained all temporary approved in 2022, too, despite the fact that, in addition to all previous risk and legally relevant facts, it was also known that worldwide, Switzerland, EU, USA, almost 4 million adverse events had already been reported for all COVID shots by May 2021, with Comirnaty and Spikevax alone accounting for over 1.7 million adverse events, of which 473,128 were severe adverse events and that 20,381 were deaths, exceeding the alarm value of 50 deaths worldwide more than 400-fold at that time. That despite Swissmedic's pronouncements that the MNRA shots had no effect on pregnancy, by May 2022, 2,177 stillbirths had already been reported after Comirnaty injection and 810 stillbirths after Spikevax injection, not allowing for underreporting in the EU and the USA alone, with the manufacturers still openly admitting in 2022 due to a lack of appropriate studies, the safety profile of the vaccine in pregnant and breastfeeding women is not known. That according to a study on male fertility published in June 2022, the sperm concentration 150 days after the second shot was still 15.9% below the baseline value, which means that not only female but also male fertility is potentially negatively affected by the shots. That in the course of several autopsies performed in 2022, important evidence of the lethal mode of action of the spike protein had been provided, according to which MNRA-induced spike protein production appears to be the causal cause of vascular lesions and fatal myocarditis suffered as a result. That with VAIDS, VAIDS, a long-suspected adverse event that has been detected increasingly since 2022, has become apparent, which results in damage to the immune system, which can lead not only to the increased occurrence of autoimmune diseases and cancer, but above all to the increased occurrence of infectious diseases. That by March 1st, 2022, at least 128 peer-reviewed publications on cardiac problems 223 peer-reviewed publications on life-threatening coagulation disorders, thrombosis, etc., and 7 peer-reviewed publications on possible deaths resulting from COVID shots had been published. 9. With the temporary authorization of the mRNA vaccine, Swissmedic therefore took an unprecedented and steadily increasing risk, which could at best only be justified by the fact that it could have averted an unprecedented threat caused by SARS-CoV-2, which could outweigh the risk associated with the mRNA shots. This is obviously not the case. COVID-19 is not and never was considered a life-threatening or disabling disease, the main condition of the temporary authorization, which would have threatened the entire population. In Switzerland, there were no total mortality rates for either 20 or 2021 that would have exceeded the maximum values of the previous 10 years, taking demographics into account. At no time since the outbreak of the coronavirus crisis has there been a nationwide overloading of hospitals. Despite the politically driven reduction of beds during the ongoing pandemic, the intensive care units across the country were always occupied to a maximum of 80%, which actually indicates normal operation. Globally, the lethality of SARS-CoV-2 for 2020 was 0.15% to 0.2% IFR, equivalent to that of moderate influenza. Adolescents and children with a mortality rate of 0.002% IFR were never at significant risk from SARS-CoV-2 to date. Not a single case of child death in Switzerland has been officially proven to have been caused by COVID-19. At the time of the booster authorization at the end of 2021, it was also evident that the entire population was no longer at particular risk from SARS-CoV-2 due to the prevailing Delta variant. Global lethality was still only 0.01 to 0.02 IFR, equivalent to that of mild flu. With the emergence of the Omicron variant, global lethality was still only 0.001 to 0.002% IFR. Omicron is thus at least 50 times less dangerous for the overall population than normal influenza. 10. According to the information provided above, Swissmedic has approved a highly experimental and dangerous medicinal product against a disease that posed and poses no greater threat to the general population than influenza. As a last lifeline, Swissmedic would have to prove that the somewhat higher risk of target population of elderly people and those with pre-existing illnesses would have been at least somewhat effectively protected against SARS-CoV-2. However, this is also absolutely not the case. The shot obviously fails to achieve necessary large-scale efficacy. The shots would have to protect against serious, fatal, or disabling diseases. However, the primary focus of the authorization studies, which are still ongoing, was to determine whether the shots protect against headache, cough, fever, and other minor events in combination with a positive PCR test result. The reported efficacy figures of up to 100% refer only to such minor events and are based on calculations that do not reflect reality in any way. Rather, the efficacy in the low single-digit percentage range is to be assumed, if at all. Not a single study has even come close to proving protection against severe disease. The few cases that have been studied fall within the range of statistical coincidence. Shots would have to immunize in the long term, something that has not been demonstrated in a single study concerning mRNA shots. The mRNA shots quite clearly failed to exert the necessary long-lasting effect, otherwise no boosters would need to be propagated, which were planned from the beginning. In addition, since the spring of 2022, a worldwide trend has emerged which suggests that vaccinated individuals become much more seriously ill than unvaccinated individuals. Meanwhile, the worldwide figures for hospitalizations and deaths are led by those who have been vaccinated several times. The efficacy is therefore presumably even negative. 11. Accordingly, Swissmedic has approved a medicinal product on the Swiss market whose risk-benefit profile is devastatingly negative. The plan to approve the mRNA shots for all adults in Switzerland from December 2020 must be qualified as a project with maximum unprecedented risk content. At the same time, the lack of efficacy of mRNA shots was apparent from the outset and has become increasingly evident as time has progressed. An unprecedented risk which, in the meantime, has already impressively manifested itself in a multitude of severe adverse events, therefore was and continues to be offset by barely measurable benefit. This consideration alone must lead to the compelling conclusion that the mRNA shots should never have been approved and that the authorizations that were nevertheless granted represent a massive breach of the due diligence requirement on the part of Swissmedic. 12. At the same time, Swissmedic also failed to take sufficient risk-reducing measures to minimize the risk to the general population posed by these mRNA shots, which were approved in violation of the law and recognized rules of good manufacturing practice. In particular, Swissmedic failed 1. To ensure rigorous product monitoring, and 2. To provide transparent information to the public, and instead prominently disseminated misleading or outright false information. In the context of market surveillance, Swissmedic made do with a purely passive reporting system, which is clearly inadequate and can in no way be regarded as risk adequate for such a novel medicinal product that is burdened with considerable risks and is still at the stage of human trials, clinical phase 3. Rather, the mRNA shots should have been subjected to active monitoring, pharmacovigilance, as understudy conditions from the outset. However, Swissmedic does not enforce even the passive reporting system in any that can be deemed legally sufficient. In Switzerland, compared to other EU countries, only about 10% of all adverse events are reported at all. This massive underreporting makes it impossible for Swissmedic and the public to recognize the full extent of the devastating consequences. On December 19, 2020, Swissmedic announced the following regarding the authorization of Comirnaty. Quote, "This represents the world's first authorization in the ordinary procedure," unquote. This statement is simply false and represents a misleading lie, which many people still mistakenly believe to be true to this day. After all, this announcement can still be viewed on the Swissmedic homepage. In the information for healthcare professionals for Comirnaty, Swissmedic published in December 2020 that, quote, "No vaccine-related effects on female fertility, pregnancy, embryo, fetal development, or the development of offspring have been observed," unquote. This is in stark contrast to study results and warnings from the manufacturer and expert committees, which were available to Swissmedic. At the end of 2020, Swissmedic had already posted on its own website a FAQ addressed to the public, which contained countless misleading details that Swissmedic could have recognized as clear misinformation based on the data already available internally at the end of 2020. Moreover, it was already clear to Swissmedic by the end of 2020 that the animal studies on toxicity and pharmacokinetics were completely inadequate or even absent, although they did contain initial risk signals, such as indications of accumulation of the toxic lipid nanoparticles, LNP. Despite this, Swissmedic announced without any evidence, by concealing the risk signals and thus acting in a misleading manner, that there was no reason to expect that components of the vaccine could be mutagenic and or carcinogenic, and that there were no indications of an accumulation of LNP. On May 7, 2021, Swissmedic issued a press release stating that there was, quote, "no international evidence," unquote, of an increased rate of deaths following mRNA injection, which, given the globally high reporting rates of 17.1 to 32.1 deaths per million doses administered up to that time, once again represented misleading and dangerous misinformation to the public. Despite explicit reference by the manufacturers to missing information concerning the elderly and those with pre-existing illnesses, Swissmedic did not include a corresponding warning in the information for healthcare professionals for Comirnaty at the end of 2021, whereupon the booster, in disregard to the missing study data, was even recommended as a priority for this age group. On December 10th, 2021, Swissmedic announced on its website a, quote, "high clinical efficacy in younger children," unquote, which is diametrically opposed to the study results. Swissmedic thus unnecessarily exposed the population group at the absolute least risk to the risk of severe adverse events and deaths in an absolutely misleading manner. In its Vigilance News of May 2022, Swissmedic omitted elementary findings from the clinical studies, such as severe adverse events and deaths that had occurred, thus misleading experts. The information for healthcare professionals and patient information, the basis of information for the treating physicians, is completely inadequate with regard to contraindications and frequent adverse events. For example, there is no reference to thromboembolic events, thromboses, etc. Although this serious and in the worst case fatal danger, pulmonary embolisms, heart attacks, and strokes, has already been proven in detail in hundreds of studies worldwide and is evident from the worldwide reports of adverse events. 13. This list is also not exhaustive. For detailed information on further misleading events, please look at the criminal claim. That's the 300-page document I mentioned. This creates the picture of a population which has not been sufficiently informed in any respect and has even been misled, which, on the basis of false assumptions, has undergone a completely novel and dangerous form of gene therapy without any significant protective effect. To this day, many people are probably entirely unaware that they are participating in a worldwide human experiment. Swissmedic and the partly complicit physicians knew better, or at least should have known better. They have all along been and are still obliged to prevent this disastrous experiment from going ahead in the first place, and to do everything in their power to stop it immediately. Accordingly, the criminal liability of the leading and vaccinating physicians, in the present case the notifying parties of the incel group, must also be examined. In particular, if they did not provide any or completely insufficient information to the patients prior to the application of the mRNA shot. Based on the documents available to date, it can be stated that either no information was provided at all, or that at best only 5 minutes of information were documented, which is simply not sufficient in view of the complexity of the mRNA shots. Thus, without informed consent, a hasty decision was made to administer a shot that could cause bodily harm or even death, which means that the criminal offenses under the Criminal Code, SCC, must also be examined. Furthermore, a violation of the prohibition on the advertising of therapeutic products must also be examined in the case of the medical community, insofar as misleading information, such as on the website of the incel group, was and is being disseminated. Also, in view of the massive underreporting, there is a strong suspicion that a large number of physicians have violated their due diligence obligations in the area of their obligations to notify under therapeutic product law. 15. With their grossly negligent behavior, the responsible persons at Swissmedic and the medical community, which is jointly responsible, have already accepted a damage to public health that goes far beyond the alleged threat of SARS-CoV-2. But this is apparently still not enough. Swissmedic has prepared everything and specially issued guidance documents to massively increase the damage already done. According to the new guidelines, Swissmedic intends to tolerate all conceivable manipulations, exchange of serotypes, strains, etc. of these shots based on the unlawful temporary initial authorizations of the mRNA shots in order to then be able to immediately authorize these modified mRNA shots, which represent completely new products and would have to go through an ordinary procedure without any safety mechanisms such as preclinical and clinical studies. 16. This planned procedure, based exclusively on emergency law, not only violates all principles of therapeutic product law in the most elementary way, but also imperative international law. According to Article 7 and Article 4, 1 and 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, no one may be subjected to medical or scientific tests without their voluntary consent, not even in the case of a public emergency. Thus, should Swissmedic actually intend to authorize new medicinal products under the guise of a pandemic, without any studies and without compelling warnings, which would be comprehensible and transparently communicated to everyone, the corresponding authorization would lead to yet another human experiment to which no one could validly consent in the absence of sufficient information. This was an obvious violation of mandatory international law, which must be prevented as a matter of urgency. 17. Without immediate intervention at all relevant levels, the health risks and damage caused by the mRNA injections already administered and those still planned will continue to increase without any significant positive benefit being achieved. To protect people living in Switzerland from the dangerous and largely ineffective mRNA injections, the urgent coercive measures, search of premises at Swissmedic, seizure of the mRNA shots, must therefore be taken immediately. In addition, it must be effectively ensured that the misled population is informed about the present facts as soon as possible. Therefore, the undersigned lawyers reserve the right to publish the present criminal claim together with its enclosures for the protection of the population. Wow, it's just incredible. I mean, this is in Switzerland, right? But there's overlapping themes, codes, international law that apply. So this is very helpful just to get an understanding of all the lies and everything they've done. And I mean, if you're, have the aptitude to go through 300 pages of all the evidence, I'm sure there's outright the same statements that have been made. They're still saying the same thing. Like the crazy train is still going on. You can go look at CDC and all these plans. They're still wanting to put the kill shot into people. I mean, through the CDC, some of these states are going to mandate it, that you to go have your kid go to school. So the murder train is going. It's child killers. These are monsters, absolute monsters. They just lied about so much stuff, misled, stuff about effectiveness, how lethal SARS-CoV-2 was. I mean, it's really incredible. And people can just go through the playlist. I don't really have a playlist. I can try to put one together on iTunes or something like that, where you can just kind of go through all of the shots at once. And it started really with Died Suddenly News and just went from there. That's kind of where I kind of picked up how bad it was, how much the damage was. And it is interesting. I mean, Anthony Fauci was just deposed. He couldn't remember anything. It's incredible stuff. He didn't want to get tied down, it seems like. But yeah, the criminals are out there. They're killing your children, killing your family. So you don't want to. I mean, you take these experimental jabs. The whole global population was just a bunch of guinea pigs. My belief is that you can induce that they probably knew some of the stuff was deadly. Like they probably knew. That's why they put it in there. And they just had to lie about it. That's my guess. So yeah, it's a great kill off. I think that's really what it is. Anybody have any questions or anything? I do have more of this in this Bioweapon Blue series. Like I said, I'll put a link to where you can find this information. But I think that this Swiss case is an important addition to what's happening in the U.S. with kind of moving slow. I would say a lot of these state AGs need to get on the ball and start realizing that people are getting harmed and murdered, killed. Because it's not going to come out of D.C. Obviously, it's controlled. DOJ is embarrassing. I don't know what to say. I mean, yeah, you can go to Rockfin. I haven't been censored on Rockfin yet, so you can watch the video and audio on Rockfin. So go check that out. I got another strike on YouTube, so I couldn't stream for a week. So my time there's probably up, and I don't care. I don't want to be part of a demonic fascist kill state, which we're in the U.S., so. And YouTube's part of it. These are all monsters. Zuckerberg's a monster. People who run Google are monsters. They're everywhere. Hell is empty. Devils are all here. Wish you well.